Salve a tutti ragazzi ed eccoci qui con una nuova serie, un nuovo gioco, un nuovo inizio, una nuova avventura. Bene, adesso siamo qui con una mod del search engine questo gioco è molto particolare, si chiama The Stanley Parable. Ebbene, questa mod vi consiglio, se la volete giocare in prima persona, vi consiglio di magari di giocarla prima di guardare questo video, in modo da avere una maggior come dire, una maggiore esperienza, una migliore esperienza. E adesso non vi dilungo troppo e andiamo subito a giocare. Vediamo di che si tratta e scoprirete presto di cosa si tratta.
This is the story of a man named Stanley. Stanley worked for a company in a big building where he was employee number 427. Employee number 427's job was simple. He sat at his desk in room 427 and he pushed buttons on a keyboard. Orders came to him through a monitor next to his desk, telling him what buttons to push, how long to push them, and in what order. This is what employee 427 did every day of every month of every year. And although others might have considered it soul-rending, Stanley relished every moment that the orders came in, as though he had been made exactly for this job. And Stanley was happy. And then one day something very peculiar happened. Something that would forever change Stanley. Something he would never quite forget. He had been at his desk for nearly an hour when he realized that not one single order had arrived on a monitor for him to follow. No one had showed up to give him instructions, call a meeting, or even say hi. Never in all his years at the company had this happened, this complete isolation. Something was very clearly wrong. Shocked, frozen solid, Stanley found himself unable to move for the longest time. But as he came to his wits and regained his senses, he got up from his desk and walked out into the hallway.
Oh, eccoci qui. Possiamo di nuovo muoverci. Prima di iniziare a camminare e a fare tutto quel che dobbiamo fare in questo gioco, voglio dirvi soltanto una cosa. L'unica cosa che so è che c'è questo narratore che ci narra le nostre storie, diciamo, quelle che dobbiamo fare. Tutte le informazioni di questo gioco le avete in descrizione e adesso andiamo a iniziare. So che siete curiosi di questa cosa. Andiamo.
Stanley decided to go to the staff lounge to check on his
veramente?
coworkers.
E se non ci volessi
He
andare?
never functioned well by himself. And
Ah, in questo gioco non si può
constantly needed
saltare, a
support
quanto
and
pare.
guidance from others. So the thought of total
Peccato, mi volevo
solitude was
divertire.
terrifying
Cosa c'è
to
qui?
him.
YouPorn. Non è vero. So che però c'è. Andiamo avanti.
When Stanley came to a set of two open doors, he entered the door on his left.
Non credo proprio. E se io volessi fare un'altra cosa? Io vado controvento. Controcorrente, come si diceva?
This was not the correct way to the employee lounge, and Stanley knew it perfectly well. So he turned left at the first open door and walked back in the right direction.
Nah. Cosa mi potrà mai succedere?
Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago. Maybe this is why everyone had left. No one wanted to be around someone as bad at this thing as him. And since he was walking into the middle of nowhere and thus ruining the entire story, Stanley decided that he would punish himself. So when he came to the elevator and the doors opened, he stepped inside and pushed the button to go up.
Piano di sopra. Mi rifiuto. Non ci voglio andare. No. Non mi costringerai a fare questo. No, non ci pensare neanche. Ok, lo faccio. Posso scegliere. Io vado sotto. Ciao. Ti ho fregato.
Oh, Stanley. You know, you really aren't going anywhere, and I don't say that deceitfully. I truthfully mean that there isn't a story down here. The story was back up where I told you to go.
Non ci voglio andare.
Right now, you're just running around looking at empty halls. And frankly, that's perhaps even more infuriating for me. So why don't you throw me a bone? Give me a chance and just let me tell the story I want to tell.
Ok, una sola chance però. Poi me ne vado a fare quelle cose mie. Andiamo. Questi corridoi sono molto lunghi. Oh, eccoci qui.
Now listen carefully. This is important. Stanley walked through the red door.
Ah, sono daltonico, qual è la porta rossa? Ok, va bene, questa volta vado di qui. E oh, olè, olè, oh, va bene. Ok. Cosa succede?
Good, good. Now, if you don't mind, there's something I'd like to show you. But to do that, I think it would be best for us to start from the beginning.
Oddio, questo messaggio antipatico. Allora.
This is a very sad story about the death of a man
No.
named Stanley.
No, ma come? No.
Stanley worked for a company in a big building where he was employee number 427.
Ecco.
His job pushing buttons demanded little of him, so there was not much of himself to give. And in this way, Stanley's job felt less and less like his every day. But if buttons need pushing one day, it means they'll need pushing the next and then the next. So, without question or judgment, Stanley continued to do what the screen told him. One keystroke flowed into another keystroke, flowed into his ride home, flowed into dinner, flowed into waking up, flowed into going to work, and here he was again. Stanley was typing out a complete sentence that said absolutely nothing at all. If in reality no one ever actually disappeared from the office, and Stanley never got the opportunity to make a decision, to choose which path he wanted to take, would his life still have any meaning? Perhaps when we long for something deeply enough, these hopes and fantasies become so strong in our minds that we truly believe that we're there, controlling that person, and living that adventure. To manipulate your own thoughts and emotions might mean freedom from a self-imposed prison, but these delusions can be fatal to those who can't tell the difference. And so, Stanley asked, if that door never opened, if I'll never be able to walk away from those people and from these buttons, is this life still worth experiencing? Am I actually happy? Stanley answered this question by pushing a button.
Please die.
And then he pushed a button. Then he pushed a button. Then he pushed a button.
Non ce la faccio più, basta. No, ma è già finito. Ma come? Ho fatto venire tutto. Oh, allora, questo è il secondo tentativo. Allora.
Stanley decided to go to the
sì, va bene. Ho fatto finire proprio bruscamente la volta precedente. Ho fatto un piccolissimo errore. Ho fatto morire Stanley. Ma questo sta ancora su. Red Tube stavolta. Va bene. Va bene, va bene. Allora.
When Stanley came to a set of two open doors,
sì.
He entered the door on his left.
Dai, facciamo come dice, se no qui va a finire male. Abbiamo inteso. Dai. Vediamo come va a finire. Andiamo avanti, ancora avanti e ancora avanti. Eccoci qui.
Stanley entered the lounge. He was horrified to find not a single person here. He decided he would walk up to see his boss, hoping that he would find an answer there.
Sì, andiamo dal boss. Dal boss mafioso. Andiamo dal boss. Andiamo dal boss. Dai. Boss. Guarda là. Madò, che cose, basta.
Coming to a staircase, Stanley walked upstairs to his boss's office.
Se andassi sotto? Andiamo sotto.
But Stanley just couldn't do it. He considered the possibility of facing his boss, of admitting that he had left his post during work hours. He might be fired for that. And in such a competitive
esattamente, è
economy,
proprio
was
questo che
it
stavo
really
pensando,
worth
non a
taking the
fregarsi,
risk?
ma quando mai?
All because he believed everyone had disappeared? His boss would think he was crazy. And then something occurred to Stanley. Maybe, he thought to himself, maybe I am crazy. Everyone I know simply vanishing out of the blue, there's almost no other explanation for it. And a nagging fear began to creep up in his mind. Questions that had been there all along. He just hadn't put his finger on them yet. For example, why couldn't he see his feet when he looked down? Why did doors close automatically behind him wherever he went? And for that matter, these rooms were starting to look pretty familiar. Was he just walking around in circles? Where am I, he thought. And the more he found himself unable to answer these questions, the more questions continued to arise, until he came to the issue that had been slowly boiling until he could ignore it no longer. Why is there a voice in my head, dictating everything that I'm doing?
Hai finito? Non sono pazzo, ok?
Every door slammed shut. No, Stanley screamed. I need to get out of here. I need to know that there's something out there. I need to know it's not just all in my head. And he screamed and clutched at his skull as the voice grew harsher and the music in the background rose higher and higher.
Non sono pazzo.
And then,
Devo giocare a
moments
scacchi.
before collapsing to the ground, Stanley clenched his fists and screamed to anyone who might be listening, I'm not real! I'm not real! Don't believe any of it! None of it's real!
Sono diventato pazzo adesso.
This is the story of a woman named Mariella.
Ma come? Ma come Mariella?
Mariella woke up on a day like any other. She got dressed, went to work, clocked in, clocked out, and then she walked home. But her walk on this day was interrupted by the body of a man who had stumbled through town, talking and screaming to himself, and then collapsed dead on the sidewalk.
Dai.
Moments after seeing him, she would turn, run to the nearest police station, and call for an ambulance. But for just a few brief seconds, she merely stood there, unable to move. The tragedy was not the death of a single person. It was that she would never know this man's story, never hear in his own words what had happened to him, or what he believed had happened to him. For to know these things would be to exist inside the head of the man himself. So all she could do was observe from a distance and pity him.
No.
But Mariella had places to be and people to meet with, very important people whose impressions of her would affect her career and indeed the rest of her life. She stood there for only a moment, looking down at the body, and then she ran.
Ma dai! Oh, maledizione! Maledetto me!